Good evening, and thank you for attending this virtual public meeting on the Montgomery County Complete Streets Design Guideline. My name is Steve Aldridge from Montgomery Planning, and joining me tonight is Andrew Bossy from the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. This is the first study led jointly by these two agencies, and we are really excited to share findings of our draft document tonight. The format for tonight's meeting is a 45-minute presentation followed by a question and answer session. Questions can be posted using the chat feature in Microsoft Teams, and then after the presentation, we will restate each question and respond verbally. To help you find the Q&A chat, there's an icon located in the upper right side of the screen that will open a chat window. It'll show up on the right side. In addition, there's a closed caption button and a full screen button on the lower right side of the screen, just to help you use other options. In the Q&A, we've added a sign-in sheet where we're asking for your name and your email address if you're interested in being added to our contact and getting more information about the project. So tonight, through this meeting, we're going to talk about the Complete Streets Design Guideline, background of the project, the process for developing this guide, an overview of the draft guideline, and then a discussion of next steps, and then we'll go to questions. So what are complete streets? Complete streets are roadways that are designed and operated to provide safe, accessible, and healthy travel for all users of the roadway system, including pedestrians, bicyclists, transit riders, and motorists. On a complete street, it is intuitive and safe to cross the street, walk to shops, and bicycle to school. The guidelines will provide a one-stop reference for street improvements on Montgomery County streets. One of the primary motivations for this guidelines is the county's Vision Zero goal to eliminate traffic fatalities and serious injuries. Montgomery County adopted a Vision Zero resolution in 2016, making it one of the first counties in the nation to do so. And Vision Zero is an approach to road safety that uses design, education, and enforcement to eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries. So these guidelines, they have many uses, but they will supplement county master plans and design standards, guide design of capital improvements and development projects. The primary emphasis is on county streets, though we fully intend that these guidelines will really present our vision of what we'd like to see on state-owned roadways. It will require some changes to design standards and the county code to be consistent with this guidance. And certainly who will use this guide? This is a very technical document. So certainly primary users are likely to include county staff, developers and design consultants who are working on developer projects or street projects, as well as the public. There's a lot of information in this 240-page document. And you know, if you've already taken a look at it, that's great. But hopefully once you see this presentation, it will lead you to want to look at it a little bit more. We started this project a year and a half ago, and both agencies have conducted a very detailed review process as shown here, researching other complete street plans across the country, identifying what really matters here in Montgomery County, and working through a lot of technical details. We are now at the presentation of the draft guidelines and the public comment and planning board review stage. Throughout this project, there has been significant involvement from both the Montgomery Planning and Montgomery County DOT staff, as well as the Department of Permitting Services. There's been some initial public feedback, including a developer open house, and some meetings that we've already been holding since the release of the draft document. And we have been coordinating with the State Highway Administration who also recently released their own context-driven road design approach. So we're really trying to get as much input into this plan as possible. And I will mention on the next steps, we are looking to do coordination meetings with small groups, whether that's organizations, committees within the county. So if you folks have an interest in having Andrew and myself come to give you a 15 to 30-minute presentation, please send us an email or even note it in the Q&A chat. So the Complete Streets Design Guideline has 10 chapters, and we're going to take you very briefly through each of the chapters. Chapter 1 presents the vision for the plan, and I think it's really important that you know, the vision. Sorry, the lights went off. The vision is to really develop guidelines that help to transform streets into great places that are equitably shared among diverse communities, following the 3 principles of safety, sustainability, and vitality. Chapter 2 presents new street types that will be used to establish design priorities and parameters for individual streets. These street types focus on the types of streets that we want to build moving forward. Not necessarily what the road looks like today, but how we want the road to look in the future. These new street types are largely defined by land use and urban form, as well as transportation function. And they, as a result, will vary more frequently along the length of a roadway. So one example, if you look at Georgia Avenue, it's an arterial by today's standards for its entire length in Montgomery County. However, the context changes greatly from Olney to downtown Silver Spring and in between. And so the Complete Streets Design principle is that the design of the street should also change based on that changing context. So there are 12 street types that we have developed for this study. And what you'll notice is that there are actually 5 land types: downtown, town center, suburban, neighborhood, industrial, and country. And so within each of these area types, there are a couple of different street types. The first street type, downtown boulevards, are main streets you would find in CBDs. These typically have BRT routes planned along them and have frequent transit service and high pedestrian and bicycle activity. Examples shown within the guide and on the screen here include Georgia Avenue in downtown Wheaton, Rockville Pike in White Flint, and Wisconsin Avenue in downtown Bethesda. Downtown streets are often the side streets in these same downtown areas. They typically have moderate transit service and high pedestrian and bicycle activity. Examples include Fenton Street in downtown Silver Spring, Nicholson Lane in White Flint, and Grandview Avenue in downtown Wheaton. Boulevards are the main arteries in the suburban portion of the county that provide critical connections between major activity centers. These roads have frequent transit service, are likely a master plan BRT corridor, and typically have moderate pedestrian and bicycle activity. Access to transit has typically been the priority in the past in providing bicycle and pedestrian facility along these corridors. Town center boulevards are located in medium to small activity centers, of which there are many within the county in a wide range of contexts. These roads provide high traffic volumes, frequent transit service, and moderate to high pedestrian and bicycle activity. Examples shown include Connecticut Avenue in Aspen Hill, Veers Mill Road near Randolph Road, and River Road in West Bard. And I will note that this area type also includes areas such as Damascus, Olney, Germantown, and Burtonsville in the up and northern portions of the county. Town center streets are typically the side streets in town center areas. They can provide moderate intensity development, including commercial and residential development. Along these roads, transit service is typically moderate, and pedestrian and bicycle activity can range from moderate to high. Examples shown on this slide include Carroll Avenue in Tacoma Park, Century Boulevard in Germantown, and Tuckerman Lane near Grosvenor Metro Station. Neighborhood streets are residential through streets. In our current road code, these streets are typically considered as minor arterials or primary residential streets. Along these roads, transit service is typically moderate to high, and pedestrian and bicycle activity is moderate. Neighborhood streets are really the backbone of most residential neighborhoods. Pedestrian and bicycle activity should be prioritized on these streets, as most of us probably live on these streets, and transit service is limited if non-existent on these streets. Examples shown here include Wexhall Drive in Fairland, Queen Mary Drive in Olney, and Rolling Green Way in North Potomac. As you can see, not all of these streets currently include sidewalks or side paths, which might be counterintuitive to the intended use of these streets. Neighborhood yield streets are more narrow residential streets. These streets are very common in older residential areas in the county. With a total width of typically 28 feet, the street does not have a double yellow center line, and they usually has parking on both sides of the street, and vehicular travel really has to occur through one lane, and drivers have to negotiate and navigate around parked cars and the cars coming the other direction, as there's only one effective travel lane. As a result, these streets typically have slower vehicular travel speeds. Pedestrian and bicycle activity is also very important on these kind of streets, and there's definitely no transit service on most of these streets. Example of this street type includes Sanford Road in Forest Glen, Allegheny Avenue in Tacoma Park, and Mansfield Road in Silver Spring. Industrial streets are 2 to 5 lane streets that service and pass through industrial areas in the county. While there is a need on this street type to consider a higher percentage of large vehicles, these streets typically have moderate transit service and moderate pedestrian and bicycle activity, and many of them are often through streets as well. They have some arterial function. Country connectors are the arterial streets in the rural areas of the county, and they provide a critical role in connecting communities. These streets typically have low to moderate transit service and low to moderate pedestrian and bicycle activity. This is one street type where it's clear that we have not always done enough in providing pedestrian and bicycle facilities in the past. Examples of this street type include Seneca Road, Germantown Road between Germantown Park Drive and Darnestown, sort of the southwestern part of Germantown Road, and New Hampshire Avenue and / Damascus Road between Ashton and Damascus. Country roads are the main residential streets in rural areas of the county. Transit service along these roads can vary based on context, and pedestrian and bicycle activity can range from low to moderate. These roads are typically uncurbed, but some of them may have curbs in sections. This is the last of the 12 street types. Major highways are limited or controlled access streets that were designed to focus on vehicular throughput. On the street types, transit service can range from moderate to frequent, and pedestrian activity is typically low. Examples of this street type include Sam Ike Highway near Washington Boulevard, Great Seneca Highway, and Columbia Pike north of Industrial Drive. In addition to the core street types, there are also more rare or unusual street types that the guide touches on briefly. For each street type, design guidance is provided within this document and is provided in more detail in each of the following chapters that Andrew's going to talk about in just a second. But there are a lot of different elements, some of them physical, some of them geometric, some of them operational, and I think each of the street types has some slight different nuances. So Chapter 3 outlines the county's decision-making framework for street design with an emphasis on identifying priorities in places with limited right-of-way. The master plan of highways and area master plans have established these rights-of-way, and these guidelines are not changing that. The intent of this chapter is to help designers prioritize improvements within these constrained rights of way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Bossy with the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. I will take us through the rest of the chapters. I apologize for the volume of information here on this slide, but fortunately, you don't really need to digest it. This is an excerpt of our, as I say, master table, which takes a lot of information from all the other chapters and tries to put it in one place. This gives the width for parts of a street, including travel lanes, sidewalks, and bikeways. The widths include detail on defaults and minimums, and these minimums provide guidance for when right-of-way is limited for fitting everything in. On the next slide, this is the second of Chapter 3's important tables. When there isn't enough right-of-way to fit everything in, the table from the previous slide gives you the minimum widths that things can be reduced to. This slide tells you the priority of how to go about reducing things. You will see that maintenance buffers and medians are often the first to be reduced. It tends to be just kind of excess green space in a way. Pedestrian clear zones are upheld across nearly every street type. We've already had a fair amount of feedback on these draft priorities, and if you want to see anything changed here, that's important feedback to include in filling out our comment survey. We'll include a link to the survey at the end of the presentation. We'll post it in the chat, and we'll also include it on both plannings, actually it's already there, on both plannings and DOT's Complete Streets web pages, which again, we'll have links to at the end of the presentation, and we'll get those in chat. On to the next slide. So I'm about to talk about a whole lot of zones, and it's easy to get, as I say, zoned out from how many times I'm about to mention the word zone. There are basically 6 areas I'm about to dive into, moving from the left or the outside of the street and moving inward toward the center of the street. We'll start with the sidewalk zone, which includes the frontage, pedestrian clear, and street buffer zones, and then we'll go to the street zone, which includes the curbside, travelway, and median zones. Chapter 4 focuses on the sidewalk zone, which includes elements located between the curb and the property line. This gives design guidance for the 3 zones that comprise this area. The frontage zone is on the outside, up against the right-of-way line. It's in part to provide a maintenance buffer, or it can also be an amenity space for things like outdoor cafe seating. The pedestrian clear zone is, to me, the most important area. This is intended to be completely clear, meaning no signs, no poles, no grates. It's supposed to be as straight as can be, and pavement must comply with ADA requirements. These clear zones have been our standard for many years now, but this guide is mostly making them even bigger, particularly in downtown and town center areas. Our standards have been about 5-6 feet up to today. This is going to increase that. The street buffer zone is where you'll usually find landscaping. It may include street-side furniture like benches and waste bins. It's also where poles, signs, parking meters, and all that stuff are to be located. This is where you'll likely find bike racks and where we expect scooters to be parked. This also includes off-street bikeways, which I'll come back to later on. Chapter 4 also includes information on signing, transit stops, open section roadways, which are streets that don't have curbs, driveways, street lighting, and maintenance responsibilities. Now onto the sidewalk zone guidance. Oops, could you step back one, please? This chart here includes a number of other features. This table from Chapter 4 shows what features are required, recommended, or optional across each street type. You'll see a similar chart for each of the zones going forward. The green areas like trees, landscaping, and rain gardens are required across most street types, as are sidewalk level driveways. This means if you're a pedestrian traveling along a sidewalk, you won't have to deal with using ramps to go down and up at each driveway. The sidewalk is your space. Pedestrians are the priority, and so pedestrians stay at the same level. Cars turning in and out of driveways will have to go up or down in the area between the sidewalk and travel lanes. Chapter 5 focuses on the street zone. This is the vehicular area between the curbs. This area is comprised of 3 other zones, the curbside, travelway, and median. And this chapter also includes guidance on utilities and network connectivity. Much of the list here is of things in the curbside zone. That includes stuff like parking, loading, and parklets. At the bottom is travel lanes, which are, along with dedicated transit lanes, are part of the travelway zone. And the median zone referenced at the bottom is, of course, the area at the middle of some streets that's usually landscaped. So just like in the sidewalk zone, there's a table that shows here a number of facilities and whether they're required, recommended, or optional along each street type. You'll see that when a median is provided, we intend for it to have landscaping in every instance. We're looking to underground utilities, as well as minimize and consolidate driveways, particularly in downtown and town center areas. We note a need for pickup drop-off zones, accessible parking, car share parking, electric vehicle charging spaces, particularly in downtown and town center areas. These are all pretty new things for the county, and we still don't really have detailed guidance or standards on these. This guide more establishes our interest and is the first step in really getting these moving. The guide includes widths for each street feature, including as travel lanes, as you can see here. The current road code calls for narrower lanes only in downtown areas, and we're looking to take this even further, perhaps most noticeable also in town center and neighborhood areas. This is an important part of both slowing traffic as well as reducing crossing distances for pedestrians. This guide won't really change when medians are included from where we are today, but it does provide guidance on median design. It generally requires a minimum 6-foot median, which corresponds, when a median is provided, of course, which corresponds to the width required for a median to provide room for pedestrians and bicyclists to use it. The larger number that you see in this table here, usually about 16 feet, 10 feet, 17 feet, that larger number is mostly that 6 feet plus the travel lane width, which would allow the median to include a left turn lane while still maintaining a 6-foot ped bike area. The exceptions to this are on downtown streets and town center streets, where turn lanes would completely replace a median area, potentially. You see this occasionally already in Montgomery County, and it's especially common in our neighboring jurisdictions. Chapter 5 also provides guidance for utilities, and it includes a section on promoting connections within the street network. So basically, getting away from dead-end streets and cul-de-sacs, moving towards grids that provide more options, resiliency, and improve pedestrian and bicycle connections. Sounds like the fireworks might be starting up in my neighborhood, so hopefully that'll stay quiet for a little bit longer yet. Chapter 6 covers intersections in quite a lot of detail. I want to highlight a few key sections here. Access management is something we expect we'll dive deeper into in the coming couple of years. Geometric design and design vehicles focuses on trying to design for tighter turn radii. That basically means more pedestrian and bicycle space, and cars have to go slower when they're making those turns. Mitigating conflicts generally looks at ways to make intersections safer, and this also includes a lot of guidance that really centers pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit through intersections. A good example is that this continues what has been county policy for a while, seeking to eliminate most channelized right turn lanes. That was the last bullet, really trying to not have any more channelized right turn lanes other than where they're expressly urgently needed, with really no other exceptions. The chart you see on the screen now, just like sidewalks and streets, this is a table showing intersection features and whether they're required, recommended, or optional. Here, I'll call out how pedestrian signals, pedestrian lighting, and bikeway markings are required across nearly every street type. Along downtown streets and town center streets, this opens the door to using speed tables and raised crosswalks to slow traffic and provide for safer crossings. This is a pretty substantial change from where our policy has been. There's a row that references pedestrian recall. This might be a jargony term, but pedestrian recall just means that the pedestrian walk comes up every cycle, whether someone presses the button or not. We have this in place today in a few of our downtown areas, and this guide suggests that we need to do it more regularly throughout both downtown and town center, and possibly even more areas. I'll add that at this point, the buttons themselves would still be there, as they provide instructions and location feedback required for ADA needs. Also, the guide keeps doing what we've been doing in recent years when it comes to things like providing countdown signals, accessible pedestrian signals, which are the beeping sounds you hear when you're at a traffic signal, and also ramp design, such as ensuring that pedestrian ramps directly align with the receiving ramp. We should not be building any new ramps that align pedestrians into the middle of an intersection. This slide that you see up here it's a huge change from where we are today, and this is, to me, one of the more exciting things. So today, in many areas, you may not have a protected crossing available to you if you want to cross a street. In many cases, that might mean you don't have a signal. You may have to choose between either entering and crossing through traffic where you are without any signal, which can be unnerving, or you travel maybe 10, 15, even more minutes to in each direction to get to a safer place to cross, which can be annoying, and people just don't really want to spend that amount of time. Usually, most people just take their chances crossing where they are. We can do better. This guide proposes a mixture of maximum and minimum spacings. The minimums on the right of the table is the spacing between signals, and is generally intended to keep signals from overlapping with each other operationally, but the maximums on the left are what's the most exciting here. These maximums set the guidance for the furthest someone should have to walk, bike, or roll to get to a protected crossing. You'll see in busier downtown and town center areas, we want more crossings closer together. As you get out into the more into the more rural areas, it can still be a bit far, but it's much closer spacing than where we are today. And our expectation is that in most of these areas, the densities are so low that most people are probably already going to be nearer to where those crossings are located, less likely to be at the bigger distances you see there. Chapter 7 provides guidance for building green streets, which focuses on vegetation in Section 7.2, and in Section 7.3, there's stormwater management. This is all intended to help the environment while also making streets just pretty and pleasant places to be. Chapter 8. The design guidelines in Chapter 8 largely pull directly from the master plan, the bicycle master plan, though it takes it a step further by providing some more detailed design parameters for each bikeway type. So far, I haven't really mentioned bikeways too much, but the guide includes a lot of information on them. And again, as I said, it really is pulling from the bicycle master plan approved, I think, 2 years ago. It establishes default bikeways for each street type, though the bicycle master plan can override these defaults, and as can detailed engineering if it's found that something different makes more sense. Most notably, our guide suggests separated bike lanes in downtown and town center areas, which helps separate traffic by giving bicyclists their own spaces to be apart from motor vehicles, as well as apart from pedestrians. In areas with fewer pedestrians and bicyclists, shared pedestrian-bicycle side paths remain the default, but they are generally proposed to be wider. And as I mentioned, the bike master plan recommends a number of areas for separated bikeways because even though they're outside of downtowns and town centers, there's still a need for that separation. So the bike master plan does see that even beyond those areas, there's still need for something higher intensity. The bike master plan also includes breezeways, which are intended to be sort of like bicycle highways. This guide does not yet establish design guidance on those, but it's something we're very mindful of a need for. So far, we've been going with very wide 16-foot areas for breezeways and expect that may be further refined in coming years, likely to be featured in the Complete Street Guide's next version. The Complete Streets Guide also includes guidance on some other conflict areas, including bike lanes alongside floating bus stops and bike lanes along on-street parking. Chapter 9 focuses on speed management and is organized into 3 sections, which I'll get into in the next few slides. Slower speeds are a big focus of this guide, as speeds are one of the most pressing issues identified for achieving Vision Zero. The graphic at the right really highlights how speed affects a driver's field of vision, as you see it toward the top, their ability to stop around the middle, and the lethality in the event that a motorist strikes a pedestrian. We generally use 4 different types of speeds: target, design, posted, and operating. Each sort of leads into the next, and the ultimate goal is for all 4 to eventually be equal. The target speed, which is what you see on the chart, and I'll come back to in a moment, is basically a master planned speed. This is the ultimate speed that we want motorists to travel at by the lifetime of a master plan. The design speed is used in engineering a roadway. It should match the target speed and design it so that motorists will travel kind of naturally, instinctively at that speed. The posted speed is what you see on the signs when you're driving. It should eventually match the design speed, which should match the target speed. And the last of those 4, the operating speed, that's what motorists are actually driving at. It should eventually match the posted speed, match the design speed, and match the target speed. The intent is for the design of a roadway to naturally guide you to the speeds you should be at. Speeding shouldn't be inadvertent. So getting back to the table here, it all starts with those target speeds. As I said, sort of the master plan speed. With Vision Zero in mind, this guide sets lower target speeds than we have today across every street type. This is especially pronounced in downtown, town center, and neighborhood areas. If you've heard of the 20 is Plenty campaign, this draws directly from that. With those target speeds, it's up to engineers to design the road so that motorists travel at those desired speeds. Ideally, you shouldn't even have to look at a speed limit sign. The street itself will guide you into driving at the correct speed. That's the hope. This table includes guidance on how to do that. As with previous charts and earlier slides, which lists a number of different things and labels them required, recommended, or optional. Required along almost every street type is a sense of enclosure, which you see down at the bottom, which means designing buildings to be near to the right-of-way, providing a tree canopy, providing street parking, and other features that naturally slow down traffic and makes you feel more closed in. There's also guidance on other means of managing speeds, sorted into road narrowing, such as reducing the number of lanes or narrowing lanes. Though to that latter point, narrower lanes are already proposed to be the default for some of the street types. Vertical measures, such as speed humps, speed tables, and raised crosswalks, Speed tables are sort of longer speed humps, and raised crosswalks are pretty much just speed tables with crosswalks on them. These all differ from what is called speed bumps, which are tiny and extremely bouncy things you'll sometimes come across in private parking lots. We don't build those. Speed humps and tables don't require you to slow to a crawl to travel over them. They're tended to be more in line with the target speeds. Horizontal measures use things like curb extensions, bulb outs, chokers, and islands to make a road seem narrower. We already use these quite frequently in Montgomery County. Traffic diverters, which we also use, are found in some neighborhoods and can block through flow. One of the more common uses is turning a four-way intersection instead into a pair of 90-degree curves. And chicanes cause the travel way to shift left and right, kind of like the word is probably most known to some from racing. Causes you have to veer left and right, and it forces a motorist to travel within a certain speed to navigate through those kind of sequential curves. Lastly, there are the surface treatments, such as using lines or rumble strips across a roadway that can make a motorist feel like they're traveling quickly, or perhaps using textured pavements. Chapter 9 also includes a section that focuses on arterial roadways specifically, as these are where a disproportionate number of fatal and severe crashes occur, and by the nature of their size, they are also the most difficult to slow. Of course, this can remain difficult if there is non-support for reallocating space to provide for safer configurations, or as many of these corridors are state roads that aren't formally within our jurisdiction. Master plans are among the key starting points in identifying where things, like you see on the screen here, are perhaps most viable and desirable. Just about done here, but Chapter 10 is about implementation, including agency roles and responsibilities and the project development process. Sections here include agency responsibilities on streets, project development process, permits and approvals, and design exceptions. And this graphic is part of a two-page pair of flowcharts. They show the process for a new project from its initial concept all the way to getting it constructed. The left side of the pages shows the flowchart for public sector projects, an excerpt of which is shown here, and the right side shows the flowchart for private sector projects, such as those built by new development. And with that, we're pretty much at the end of the document. I'm going to turn it back to Steve for our closing slides before we head into Q&A.
Thank you, Andrew. So currently, we're now in the public review process, and as I mentioned, we're very interested in having as many small virtual meetings as possible with interested parties. So if you're listening, please contact us. We'd be happy to come to your organization's meeting. Basically, the schedule is between now and July 23rd. We need to get as much public input as possible. On July 23rd, there will be a public hearing in front of the planning board, which will be an opportunity for folks to testify. So we figure the more outreach we can do in advance of that, we can really help to inform what's in the plan, how does it work or does not work for you, and then give you an opportunity to prepare written comments to the chair of the planning board. Going further, this will have work sessions with the planning board in the fall, eventually be transmitted to the county executive and the county council for detailed review and approval. There will be changes once this guideline is finalized to make some changes to the county code, executive regulations, and there would be a requirement to change the master plan of highways and transitways, which is the tool that we use at the planning department to classify all the streets and assign it certain categories and certain restrictions. But what's really important is that this is a living document. The document, it says on the front page, version 1.0, and we truly see this as an evolutionary and evolving document, that as we continue in our progress to work on our Vision Zero goal, and even to expand on some of the things that we're now exploring as part of our general plan, that we can keep making refinements to make our streets safer and more, more user-friendly for all users of the roadway system. And with that, we're happy to take questions. I see we've had a couple comments already, but I think I'll turn it over to Katie, our moderator, to take us through some questions.
Hey, Steve, thanks for that. Yeah, we do have a couple questions, and we'll just jump right into it. And I think this will work for both you and Andrew to give your 2 cents on. So our first question says, the residential collector streets in my area of Silver Spring have very high vehicle volumes during rush hour and therefore many failing intersections. How will this be accommodated in the complete streets proposals? Steve, you want to take that first?
Sure. And actually, I think Andrew might need to jump in here as well. But I think the key is that if you live on a street like that, you may not have sidewalks, you may not have bike facilities, you may not have parking. And so this guideline is going to provide a way that we can provide all of those facilities on that road. And so when we start looking at, if you have high volumes, you may have some crash history as well. So certainly looking at improving the cross section and making it usable for all is a start. There also are some treatments in terms of the intersection chapter, which is, and I think this is some of the practices we currently do, whether it's cutting off access, eliminating channelized right turn lanes, putting up no turn on red. So there are some things that can discourage traffic from cutting through on your street, certainly traffic calming. But I think maybe Andrew, you could chime in on this as well.
Sure. I see there's 2 approaches also to how you may address congestion. First is from the master plan level, which is going to look at the traffic patterns, I guess more cloud level, and what are the traffic needs that are out there, and look at what capital projects are necessary either to induce a mode shift and get more people toward transit, or to address those congestion issues, or to try to route that traffic elsewhere. Then after that, there's still sort of DOT can get involved and look at spot needs. Of course, we're trying to get away from just widening every intersection to try and address congestion. That's why we're looking to try and complete streets as a part of getting more people into basically out of their cars, and so that they're not traffic themselves.
Thanks to you both. Okay, we have another question that kind of relates to high traffic volumes in the Lower County area. So reading this question, it says, regarding speed management section, again, the prevailing speed during rush hours in the Lower County is often much lower than your already low target speeds. So then, and I'm paraphrasing here, is the Complete Streets Guide trying to then help increase speeds to reach target speeds where they're, especially during rush hour times, not even getting to that point, if that makes sense?
I'll take that one, and I'd say no, that's not the intent, is to increase speeds. I think we actually set these pretty low, and we'd be surprised how many streets are out there where the speeds are already beneath those numbers. We thought they were pretty low. The intent's certainly not to bring them up to speed. I think if they're operating just fine at those slower speeds, I think we want to encourage that. Of course, master plans, again, are going to, as they look at these areas, like this guide itself is not going to necessarily change things right away. Master plans will still use these target speeds and look at those conditions more specifically, as well as DOT projects. They're going to come through, and there's still a public process and so forth. And the intent's not to increase speeds, but there's still going to be a process to weigh in and see that we want those to be even slower.
Steve, you have anything to add?
Yes. I think what's really important is that the target speeds and the speed management, a lot of these issues are likely focused in places that may not have this situation that Brett was talking about. And I think that when we start looking at the speeds that people are traveling on most streets, people are traveling much higher than the posted speed limit. And when they don't, it's a little bit due to congestion. But I think we're really trying to really focus so that the natural speed that you travel actually fits right in. Like Andrew said, the operating speed, the design speed, the target speed, they should all be the same.
Okay, I think speed is a good topic for this group. We're getting another question about that. This next question says, how can the target speed be set at 20 miles per hour when the state has a minimum speed of 25 miles per hour?
I could take that. So there's a lot of weird laws about speed right now. In urban areas, if I recall, there's kind of exceptions for that. You can already go down to I don't believe it's defined. But yes, beyond urban areas, we are restrained by the law today. So it's right now setting our aspirations, but it will require a change in law to get lower speed limits elsewhere in the county. And where was I going with that? I thought I had another idea, but if I think of what else I wanted to say, I'll come back to that.
No problem. Steve, do you have anything you want to add? Oh, you're muted.
Well, I think that, as Andrew said, there are a lot of things that are going on in the country today in terms of Vision Zero and in terms of how fast is fast enough. Certainly, the 20th Planning campaign that started in Oregon has spread here to Montgomery County, and I think that we every year this county actually actively tries to introduce legislation to reduce the statutory speed limit to allow us to do lower speeds. And I think what you'll find is that if you drive the speed limit on a residential street when your neighbors are walking down the street, they might actually look at you kind of like slow down. And when you start realizing that, you realize that 20 might be plenty. That might be enough on most of the residential streets for sure.
And I'll add, Steve, you just said exactly what I'd forgotten. I wanted to say is that this legislation has been proposed out there, and we expect eventually it is going to pass. That's certainly our hope.
All right, we've got another question here. How did you select 400 feet as the maximum distance between protected crossings? Why not 300 or 200 feet?
So that number, we had a lot of back and forth on that, but it really comes down to signal operations and trying to ensure that there is not necessarily an overlap between the signals and that they can still function kind of together without just creating even more problems and more safety problems. We have a couple locations where we do have smaller spacings. I mean, once you get under 300 feet, really they start functioning as one signal and it doesn't operate very well. There's a couple of those around the county, and I would guess many people are probably familiar with in Silver Spring. There's Georgia Ave at Bonifant and Silver Spring Ave, I think, or maybe it's Thayer. The signals are pretty much right next to each other. They operate as one signal. But really, once you get up to about 400 feet, that's where everything can kind of function, and it still makes pretty small urban blocks. That's where we ended up there.
And Andrew, I'll just add into that when you look at 400 feet, a pedestrian that wants to get across the street, they're not going to walk 5 minutes to cross the street. So when you look at the distance and the average walking speed, I think essentially works out to about a minute. So can someone afford to walk a minute out of their way to cross the street? Yes. And so, especially when we design signal systems to provide really large bandwidths, primarily focused on vehicular travel, are there ways that we can fit these protected crossings in so that car traffic can still keep moving and not be disadvantaged? It's done in a lot of places, but it's always on a case-by-case basis. And with this guidance, we've really formalized it.
These are guidelines. If there is some compelling reason why we really do want a crossing or a signal or something within that spacing, this doesn't stop us from doing that. It's just trying to establish kind of the system-wide broad paintbrush.
All right, moving on to talking about the roadway width. Will Montgomery County reconsider the mandatory wide FEMS fire lane rules, perhaps making them conditional and a cost-benefit analysis of safety improvements of wider sidewalks and PBLs, and I think by that we mean protected bike lanes, but I'm not sure. In wider right-of-way roads, even the arterials can't have protected bike lanes if you mandate 16 to 20 feet FEMS drive lanes.
If I'm understanding that right, so we've all the numbers you see in the guide have been developed with feedback from our fire and rescue services counterparts and DPS. So what you see is basically what it is. I think for the travel lanes, they're about 10 feet minimum typically. So obviously it gets you up to about 20 feet. I think on 2-lane streets, I think we have text somewhere in there that spells out a minimum of 21 1 feet, I think it is. But that's it. We're not trying to make any wider than that in response to fire, because they've had this input. What you see is it already includes that.
All right, next question. This one's a tough one. The charts of prioritization for different street elements in constrained right-of-way gives a lot of flexibility for what to cut. This seems to contradict the guidance of the bicycle master plan, which provided a stepped list of decisions on what to take in consideration when you have a constrained corridor. Will this override that guidance?
Well, I think I can answer that one. In terms of the overall cross section, yes, these guidelines would override that. You know, the bicycle master plan was a landmark document, and that it sent out a vision for developing these bicycle facilities. But this guidance puts them in sort of in the context of all the other elements in the roadway. We're often not going to have enough space, and we're going to have to try to figure out ways to fit all of it in. And it's very, very important, especially with the now ongoing pedestrian master plan, that we give as much weight to the pedestrian environment as the bicycle environment, as the vehicle environment. We have to balance them all together, which is why this guidance, why this guidance has been developed.
All right, next question. In the near term, how do you envision these guidelines being used in existing situations when funding many of these changes may be far into the future?
I can take that one. So in the absence of funding for capital projects to retrofit, obviously that's a big constraint from the public sector. There are still some other programs that might be able to implement these things. There's some other funding options, like we have BIPA funding, which is the Bicycle Pedestrian Priority Areas. It's not a large amount of funding, so you're not going to see major reconstructions typically, but it can fit in some smaller retrofits. Really, I think from what this question is asking, it sounds like it's going to be more the public sector. A lot of our infrastructure gets rebuilt and built through new development, and yeah, in the absence of funding, that's probably where you'll see a lot of it coming from.
Okay. All right, I got another question. And Steve, you had mentioned that this is going to be a living document, and I think this question speaks to that. The question states, have you studied or will you study how these types of street function where they are in use? For example, K Street in DC does not work. Drivers are confused about which lanes to be in to make right turns. UPS, FedEx trucks block the rightmost traffic lanes. Restaurants sometimes take extra wide sidewalks and fence out outdoor dining areas, which narrows the sidewalks and defeats the wider sidewalk purpose. So how do you plan to monitor the effects of the Complete Streets guidelines?
Okay, well, this is a loaded question because it has so many elements. I think that one, while we've looked at other cities, I think our standards are different, but there are some things that are going to be evolving. Curbside management is a key part of a Complete Streets plan, and we're going to need to move forward on some enhancements to actually what's in the guide now to really look comprehensively, especially in areas where curbside space versus bike space versus parking versus ride hailing, all of those things take place. You really have to do a much more comprehensive locational view of how you manage it and manage it well. And then certainly also metro access. So there's just many things that have to be looked at from the curb. But on the sidewalk side, I think our guidance really delineates very well the protection of the pedestrian clear zone, the provision of buffers between the pedestrian clear zone and other uses, so that things like restaurants are not going to intrude into the pedestrian clear zone. And as Andrew mentioned, things like grates in the sidewalks will be avoided, if at all possible, in that place, because we realize that, certainly a flat level surface and a surface without obstructions really helps those with mobility impairments. And that's what we want the pedestrian clear zone to provide within our roadway section.
I'm going to add, nothing in this guide is proposing to build what K Street is. K Street has side running frontage lanes. which that's part of the confusion about where you want to be to make right turns or even left turns. Nothing in this guide is proposing something like that.
All right. I have actually a follow-up to a question I asked you earlier. Some points of clarification were made in private. So this person rephrased their question to say, my question was that fire and EMS often don't allow for protection of bike and pedestrians because then it would make space less than 21 feet. So what this person is asking is if we will favor pedestrian protection instead of giving the maximum fire space. 21 feet eats up a lot of right of way on roadways and sometimes makes it so there's not space for other protected movements. Hopefully I got that right this time.
Okay, so yeah, if we have a separated bikeway and it's in the master plan, we're going to have a separated bikeway. We'll find the space somehow to fit that in. Again, it's something that we have to, there might be some specific cases we have to figure out, but in general, the bike master plans looked at where the separated bikeways are going to be, and that's been largely vetted. I don't want to say there's not something out there that we missed, but that they'll fit in. And again, the widths in here are trying to, I don't see this being an issue other than a few exception cases, but hopefully we found all the spots already that this shouldn't have to come up.
Okay. All right. We're switching gears a little bit with this next question. I have a concern that nowhere in this draft does it prioritize pedestrian movement and accessibility. This is a major fault when the different demands are competing for limited right-of-way. Again, this is a major problem in the older communities where the right-of-way is extremely limited and most residential areas have no sidewalks. It's really necessary that before any broad complete streets treatment are designed, that your proposed 6-foot wide sidewalks are set first. There should be no bike lanes considered and major utility upgrades permitted until the sidewalk installation locations are improved. So Steve, would you like to speak a little bit to the accessibility concerns?
Sure. The guidelines actually do include quite a lot on providing, like I said, a safe and pretty generous over previous standards pedestrian space that's not encumbered by things like e-bikes and scooters and trash cans and things of that nature. But the guidance also includes a lot of improvements, some of which are current practices at intersections, things like sidewalk ramps that go directly from crosswalk to crosswalk, and signal improvements that make it safer for the pedestrian. Andrew, do you want to add a few things?
Yeah, I think you pretty much hit is yeah, we want sidewalks to be on all streets. I think when those are implemented is not something the guide is dealing with, but we definitely want to see those sidewalks. I think you otherwise hit most of the stuff I'd want to bring up.
Well, I think the only other thing I'll add is the last sentence is there should be no bike lanes considered and major utility upgrades permitted until the sidewalk installation locations are approved. And I'm not sure that that's something that that we can look at. The purpose of this guidance is to inform decisions when improvements are done to the road, whether it's through a development project or through county action. And so certain improvements, even if they're minor, could lead for a desire to make that road consistent with the Complete Streets design guideline for that road section. So as an example, if there are extensive enough design improvements, a sidewalk could be built as part of an upgrade, because that's, if the road didn't have any sidewalks, it would be, out of compliance with its street classification.
Great. We just got 3 more new questions. This is exciting. Andrew, I'm going to pitch this question first to you. This one's about funding. Will there be a mechanism for submitting proposals for special projects, perhaps with matching funds or as a supplement to other funding sources?
I'm not quite sure the context of that question. Obviously, special projects can mean so many different things, and who's making the proposals can have so many different routes. I think if there's I'd say if there's a source of funding, I don't want to say no, but I just don't know the details enough to get into that at this point. The guide doesn't really get into that either. It's more shaping the vision, not so much the details of implementation.
Okay. All right, and I've got another question for you both. What about using tactical urbanism strategies for temporary or interim implementation combined with the incorporation of art to create complete streets in our arts entertainment districts? How is this addressed in the guidelines?
Well, I think that the tools in the guideline provide strategies that are used today, maybe not to the extent that we want, partially because to find each guideline, you have to go to a separate requirement. So for instance, if you want to do a parklet, there's a certain guideline you have to find online. And so by having this one-stop resource, we're hoping that more community development, business improvement districts, and you know, sort of other organizations are encouraged to do more of these events. Our agency, Montgomery Planning, we do a parking day, and that's precisely what we do. We get a permit to take away some of the parking, usually in downtown Silver Spring, and we have events. We pass out materials, and we say, "Isn't this great?" That's what tactical urbanism is about, and we're hoping that more of that. But it takes more than just one agency to do that. The Montgomery Planning does a lot, but it also takes, I'd say, the combined interests within the county to make that and spread it throughout the county.
I'm going to add a little bit to that too. Is I think Steve answered the tactical part of that pretty well, but from a more permanent standpoint, achieving some of the same ideas, we have a number of shared streets, which is kind of a strange term right now. Shared streets during COVID means one thing, that's those temporary streets we're setting up, but also shared street in a before COVID means if you've been down to the wharf in DC, the street there where cars and pedestrians and bicyclists all sort of mix in the same space, we're going to see some more of that around the county. There's a few areas that have been master planned for that. I think Norfolk Ave in Bethesda is probably one of the first we'll really see. Ellsworth is actually an existing example that is kind of like that, although these days there aren't really any cars at all. Also, there's the bicycle and pedestrian priority areas. They're really funded to do these kind of low-hanging fruit but high-impact treatments. So it could include left turn hardening and center line hardening, which makes it basically slows traffic as they make right and left turns. Obviously, BIPA funding is limited just generally, but also sometimes tied to specific geographies. But I think it's a mechanism that's out there where we can try to do more of that. And the guide does also include artistic crosswalks. If anyone's tried working with DOT in the past, we have tended to be oppositional toward those. But after many internal reviews, those have stayed in the document, and that should be exciting news to many. I can't say things will change overnight, but that it's now in the guide, I think is huge that you'll see some movement on that as well.
And I will just add that, what Andrew just said there, I think you have to realize is that this is two agencies working together. We are often in agreement on many things, but sometimes we're not. And I think that this document really shows that we can work together to try to address the really important, at least transportation issues, and come up with a vision to do that.
Steve, this next question is for you. All three of the examples that you mentioned on the slide for country connectors are state roads. Can you discuss the challenge with state roads and how this guide will or won't apply to state roads?
Sure. So the challenges with state roads is that, just in general, the county has an advisory input into what the state does. And in the past, and I'll even use example maybe on more arterial roads, there have been situations where the county has actually installed sidewalk because the road was, an arterial road was built without sidewalks on both sides of the street. So when the county has a priority, occasionally they can actually pursue that kind of work. But I think the challenge is that we may not be able to, we don't necessarily have control over what goes on a state road. But this, as I said at the beginning, this presents a vision of what we'd like to see. And we can certainly work towards making sure that as development is planned, that improvements along state roads, especially developer projects, provide the facilities that are needed for pedestrians and bicycles.
Great. Andrew, this next question is for you. Once the guide is adopted, will MCDOT build out a set of standard engineering drawings for common street designs? I know that some developers have struggled to design and build quality protected bike lanes or protected intersections because they lacked implementable drawings.
This is actually another person who's been working on this project with us, whose name was on one of the slides there, Dan Sheridan. He is working on updating a lot of our standards that we've had around since 2008. And he's updating them just generally on the before complete streets needs. But it's something we can look into, certainly. Obviously, this is spelling out, this guide tells you the widths of things and generally where things are needed. But there could be still room for telling you, what do we want when we say you need to build a protected intersection? I think it is something we could look into. Likewise, what a bike lane does look like. The bike master plan includes some of that guidance. We have a little bit of that also shown in here. If there's a need, if we find people need those drawings, we can certainly look into that.
Well, Andrew, I probably shouldn't add because I'm just supposed to be moderating, but I would also suggest that we are now getting more CIP projects where we're implementing protected intersections and bike lanes the way that we really want to and we've envisioned. So maybe it might be a matter of either linking to the DAIC website or putting those in the drawings for examples or inspiration. That might be something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting that even on projects, state projects, the idea of protected intersections, while it's part of our vision and our goal, the state Highway Administration, their goals are much more closely aligned with us now with their context-driven program. They realize the value of complete streets, and even the idea of providing things like protected intersections, separated bike lanes, and floating bus stops where you have them. So I think that's a really positive advancement as we work together with our state partner.
Okay, I've got another question for you, but I did ask the person for a point of clarification, so I might need to ask this question to you twice because I may get it wrong. The guide specifies no priority for employing permeable materials when PROW or especially trail improvements are made, like your proposed allowance for 19 wide trails.
I expect that's public right of way. We actually do have that in the guide. I think there's a couple spots. There's the pedestrian clear zone section. It's on page 74. It does call out permeable paving materials. I think prioritization doesn't really say like do this in this order of this, but it does say it's something that we generally want and we will probably see more of as we're trying to reach stormwater management goals. It also comes up, I think, in the green streets area and possibly a few more sections, but those are probably the two big spots where it really is mentioned.
I also wanted to point out that we had questions earlier about EMS and space in the right-of-way, and Wade Holland out of the executive's office is on the call, and he wanted to remind us that there was a fire department access guidelines that were recently published last year, and he linked to them in the Q&A. So if you guys are watching, that's another great resource to look at to see how we're trying to work collaboratively with the fire department to meet both their needs and ours in the roadway.
And I will mention, as part of our review, we looked very closely at that document. Both the planning department and DOT were involved in the development with the Department of Permitting Services and Fire and Rescue on those documents. So our guidelines are consistent with those as well.
Right. So we have actually a couple of prepared questions because it looks like the audience is not giving us any new questions, which is totally fine. But let's see some of the things that we thought would be helpful for everyone. Hey, Steve, what are some of the big highlights and takeaways you think that folks should take away from this document? It's pretty hefty. What do you hope people take away?
Well, I hope they see that this is the new approach that's focused, from Vision Zero in slowing traffic down. We had strategies that we've been developing over the past 10 to 12 years to try to slow traffic down in the downtown areas. And what we found is that in some cases they worked pretty well, but we wanted to expand that to the suburban areas, and our current regulations don't really allow that. So by the creation of these guidelines, we're going to increase our range of choices, the ability to provide some narrower travel lanes, the ability to provide wider pedestrian space, and definitely a focus on buffers. I think both the bicycle master plan and the pedestrian master plan, sort of really highlight the fact that you can provide a great facility, but if it's not buffered from traffic, or even if the bike and the ped space aren't buffered, if it's separate facilities, then the quality of that facility is compromised. So, and the buffer space is the place where we need to fit all of this other stuff, such as trash receptacles and e-bikes and certainly street trees, which are an extremely important part of the plan.
Andrew, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Sure. For me, I'd also add slower speeds is one of the bigger highlights. More pedestrian crossings, narrower lanes, and wider pedestrian clear zones. I think the crossings and clear zones for pedestrians, to me, are probably my personal favorites. In some feedback we've had to date, we've had people really hone in on the bikeways parts, but this really hasn't changed much from the bikeway, the bicycle master plan already established. So it's nice to highlight that, but we haven't really done much. That was the work of previous planners on that one.
Andrew, I've got another question for you. You mentioned pedestrian crossings, and there seems to be a lot of interest in pedestrians being addressed in the Complete Streets Guide. Just as a nitpicky question, will this guide allow for us to have more barn stances where you can have pedestrians crossing in any direction during a signal?
So barn stances, for anyone who's not familiar, are where if you're crossing at an intersection, there's a walk phase that lets pedestrians cross diagonally. Many people here may be familiar with the one at 7th and H Street Northwest in DC's Chinatown. We've done a few of these over time, including a few technically in place today, even if they're not really designated clearly as such. This guide doesn't change anything for those. We still do them where it makes sense to do them, and we may see more of them, particularly as our downtown areas continue to grow. And I should throw the town centers in as well. I'll add that the guide does include leading pedestrian intervals, not the same, but in a similar vein. That gives pedestrians a few seconds head start to cross an intersection before cars get the green light. These are pretty common now throughout a lot of DC, and we use them in a few areas in Montgomery County. We'd probably like to use them more frequently.
So we've got a very poignant question, perfect for this time that we're living in. Will this document result in less demand on police and/or technological enforcement of speeds and other vehicle laws?
I could probably take that. Obviously, there's a major equity issue about drawing enforcement into traffic. It really creates a lot of interactions that may not always go well. As if you're following the news, you see and hear that every day now. So this is just brought at a national level. There's a push now within our industry to get away from saying enforcement as a catch-all, especially when it comes to manual enforcement, getting police officers out there with those interactions. I do think there's a role for automated enforcement, and that's now what the transportation industry is starting to rally more around in these last few weeks, because that really, it's everyone's faulted for that. There's not a, obviously there can be some equity issues about where and how they're placed, but they do catch everybody. There's no risk of interaction that comes up. And it's a more equitable approach to enforcing traffic laws. But that said, the goal ideally is to get away from needing enforcement at all. I had mentioned earlier that the intent out of how we achieve the different types of target speed, design speed, operating speed, and traveling speed. And the hope is that speeding is, you don't just do it by accident. The design guides you into the speed that you should be at. That is the vision as part of this guide. Obviously, it's an issue trying to get to that point, but so there's a role for automated enforcement, but really we're trying to cut down on the need for enforcement at all completely.
So I will mention that there is some part of the plan that, currently today, when speed limits are over 35 miles an hour, automated enforcement is not allowed. And so I guess one side benefit of having your target speeds at 35 or less is that if you actually have speeding problems, you then could use automated enforcement. So now on a road with a 40 mile an hour speed limit or a 45 mile an hour speed limit, the only kind of enforcement that can be done is manual. And so we're hoping that more of our suburban arterials will be able to be monitored automatically if those problems occur. And Andrew said, we're hoping that maybe the design treatments will obviate that, but if not, automated enforcement is certainly a tool.
Great. Hey, Andrew, you mentioned the artistic expression in the crosswalks, which I'm super excited about, and it sounds like other people are as well. This person asked, can you please explain what the guidelines say about artistic crosswalks, and are you allowing more flexibility and creativity in the MUTCD per the Federal Highway Administration?
I would point you to page 145 of the guide. That it's just that one page, it's 3 paragraphs. It has a little bit of design detail, mostly about just about the materials you would use. It's not much more detail at this point. I'd say it's really just opening the door. There still is probably more detail and policy that will have to come out of now that we've opened the door. So not an answer available at this moment, other than the door's open and we're going to work toward figuring that out.
Whereas before it was just closed.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. All right. Steve, this question's for you. What recommendations will be incorporated from the Climate Action Plan, which is still being written right now?
Well, I would say from the Climate Action Plan and the general plan that the planning department is now working on, Thrive Montgomery, there's a lot of similarity, a lot of similar actions, and I think that the Climate Action Plan is I think by 2030, and the general plan is by 2050. But the complete streets is now. And I think that we can begin to try to address many of the issues in both of those plans and try to help improve the way that we deal with those issues. And so one example might be in the complete streets plan, we talk about electrical vehicle charging. And certainly that is an evolving topic. Future versions of this guideline may have different standards that show up that allow something different than what's that's provided now. And I think that in order to respond to, we have many things we're trying to respond to, whether it's Vision Zero, our climate action plan, and now our general plan, that this definitely has to be a living, breathing document, because we are trying to improve the quality of life for all our citizens.
I'm going to add to that too. I suggest the person take a look at Chapter 7, which focuses on the green streets. So pretty much exactly, I think, what you're getting at. We're looking to provide more trees all along all streets and to incorporate more landscaping. These not only make it more comfortable to be on those streets, but they help directly address stormwater, greenhouse gases, and the heat island effect. And of course, there's how this guide generally intends to make walking, biking, and transit more attractive. The more we can look at our automotive travel, reliance on the fuel and batteries that comes out of that, and roadways' intensive uses of asphalt and concrete, the more we can do that, the more progress we'll make toward our sustainability goals.
And Steve, actually, if you could build on that, I know you just talked about it the other night. Similar situation, how will the general plan work with the Complete Streets guidelines? How do they go hand in hand?
Okay. I think that, one of the 8 subject areas in Thrive Montgomery is safe and efficient travel. And we actually had a chat last night. And Complete Streets is a response to many of the goals and policies identified in this long-range plan. Complete Streets are a proving way to design our streets in a context-sensitive manner with planning for the safety of all users. And so I think we're certainly going to keep going. And as I said before, I think we have a lot of long-range tools. This is probably the start of one of many to try to address these issues.
Okay, we have another question related to accessibility and federal guidelines. So I'm going to read the question. The guide specifies that installing accessible parking is optional. However, the proposed accessibility guidelines for pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way requires that accessible parking be installed wherever time-limited parking is installed and wherever drop-off and pickup is established at all meeting devices. This is very important as accessible parking requires an accessible path from the parking space to the sidewalk and pedestrian clear path, which directly impacts the implementation of many uses you're proposing in the furnishing zone. Is this going to be corrected or is this otherwise addressed?
I can take that. So this is absolutely an issue that needs to be addressed. And for a bit of background for everyone, the current county policy, and I'm not going to say this is good policy, but it's to provide accessible parking spaces via county-owned lots and garages. Or we also follow the state's direction at where to install accessible on-street parking spaces. Where we do provide accessible on-street spaces, they're pretty much just signs, and that the signs just restrict it to ADA parking only. And that's about it. This comment here calls out that that's not enough. We acknowledge there's a need to do better at this, but unfortunately that requires a level of effort that could not be accommodated in this guide. It's something that for me is the top need for the next version of this document. I've spoken with our parking staff specifically, and we agree that we have to figure that out. Figure 513 in the guide does show some guidance for passenger loading zones alongside a separated bike lane. And there are some accessible components in that design that could be used for accessible parking if it's on the street. As I said, I expect this topic will be something we'll be working with much more in the near future. It's also mentioned curbside management is also a topic in addition just to accessible spaces themselves, but in general, how we manage the curb is also something I think we're going to get much deeper into in the very near future.
Yeah, and as Andrew mentioned before, this is a living document, and curbside management is one of those areas. Providing accessible on-street parking is probably one of those areas, and access management to make sure that all the road is managed safely from the roadway access point. All of those may need to be modified in the long term, but I think the purpose of this meeting is to raise these questions so that we can get these questions in front of the planning board, in front of the county council, to potentially change the priorities. There are some things in our guidelines that are identified that aren't allowed today. For instance, the 20-mile-an-hour target speeds. And there are some things that we're proposing to change, but it's going to take a pretty detailed review through both the planning board and the council to work that out. And I think the more public comment we get on things you'd like added to the plan, the better.
Another question on a different topic. Are there going to be details and requirements for scooter storage, bicycles, on-street parallel spaces, etc.?
This does not get into that level of detail, other than again saying where we expect them to be. To work backward here, so parallel on-street spaces. Obviously, you'll see in the street types and the cross sections that the guide includes, we show where we want parking to be located. We don't get into the length of a space. I think typically we use about 25 feet, but this guide is not calling out that level of detail. Looking at bicycles and scooter storage. There's the street buffer zone is the area between the sidewalk pedestrian clear zone and between the curb toward the street. That's where we intend for bikes and scooters to be parked. If there's a frontage zone on the other side of the sidewalk, the other side of the clear zone, that they might also fit on there, but really the street buffers where we're looking for those to be parked. Where not myself, but others in my department and in my division are working on, I forget exactly what they're called, but basically like actual formal parking structures. That sounds like a building, like basically racks and so forth for bikes and scooters. So there'll be a bit more detail that will be coming up as part of that, but not as part of this guide. We're just saying, setting the vision for where they should be. We mentioned pedestrian clear zone, the intent. We don't want bikes or scooters in the pedestrian clear zone. That is supposed to be basically empty, clear for you to walk in without obstruction.
Great. Got a couple more questions that just came in. So, in addition to official streets, MCDOT controls parking lots, which are the locations where drivers become pedestrians, and which include many aisles that are in fact travel lanes. What guidelines and actions are in the works to address both public and private parking facilities and safe multimodal use in those spaces?
That is a good question. I don't think I've considered up to this point. So the Complete Streets Guide doesn't get into the details of those off-street facilities. We're just looking at the streets themselves. I don't want to speak too much for others just because I'm not as engaged in what our parking division would be doing toward that.
I would say, Andrew, that many of the elements that we put in here, if applicable, should apply, but our guideline is focused on the roadway rights of way, sort of entirely.
I know we've had some discussions about marking out walking areas in parking lots, but I think at this point they've been more just discussions. They haven't actually resulted in, here is what we are doing. We are definitely mindful of a need for safety needs inside our parking facilities, and just really parking facilities broadly throughout the county, even private facilities. For the last several years, I think our Vision Zero program has really looked at that as well. But I don't myself have the details to get too much further into that.
Yeah, I'll chime in that as someone who works on the development review side, that the zoning ordinance does have some stipulations for safe pedestrian movements within parking lots, both having designated walkways, and that is new to the 2014, which isn't that new anymore, but to the most recent update of the zoning ordinance. And also there's a lot of guidance in there about how accessible spaces and their clear width aisles should be dealt with. But I agree, more can be done, and maybe that's another project to put into the work plan. All right, I got another question for you guys. Where do bus-only lanes, curbside specifically, fit into the various street styles? I see plenty of transit ways, but are there provisions for speeding up on non-BRT buses? Sorry, I don't have the guide in front of me.
Okay, so I can take that one. Andrew may want to chime in as well, but I think you notice that our street types, when we show transit ways, we've shown them center running in the median. And it's not that that's the only place it can occur. I would say in general, that's where, at least from the planning department perspective, where we would prefer it. We feel like it is likely to be the most effective type of BRT transit way that can operate, but there may be many places along our network where curb running BRT is just more feasible. And the added benefit of a curb running BRT is that local bus can use that as well. The one downside is that you then have right turns at intersections and numerous curb cuts along the route where the bus performance can be compromised. And because it's curb running and it's not separated from travel lanes, so certainly we feel that overall reliability of the BRT system is better when it's in a median. But certainly curb running is part of DOT's BRT plan, and as appropriate could fit on these sections just as well. We just require a slight modification to the cross section to put BRT along the curb. Andrew, you want to add to that?
I think you hit most of the big stuff. I'll just broadly add that I agreed. We really need to try and speed up all of our buses. I mean, I'm car free myself, and before COVID, whenever I would go to meetings, I'd take the bus. So I know what it's like, and it's an important issue to me personally. But otherwise, what the guide covers, I think Steve really hit the important bits, and it's something that then, as we implement capital projects, it's something I'm trumpeting as well. The same concerns. And I also want to call out one of my colleagues, Sandy Becker, added a comment. My brain had blanked on what the word was for bicycles and scooters in the street buffer. Corrals, that's the word. And if you can see Sandy's comment, she spells out what those are, where they are, what they're for.
Yeah, thanks to Sandy.
Yes, thank you, Sandy.
All right, Andrew, I've got a tough question for you. Why are I'm sorry, and it's already controversial, it's in my mouth. Why are floating bus stops being included in complete streets design when there's no national standard in place?
Separated bike lanes somewhat inherently need floating bus stops just by the nature of how they're separated and keeping that separation. These are increasingly widespread and do follow some established national design parameters that we have rightly heard strongly from communities, especially with sensory or mobility limitations, that these can be difficult to navigate. There are concerns about the speeds of bikes, knowing where to cross the bike lane, knowing where to wait for the bus, the ability for guide dogs or other service animals to navigate the spaces, many other issues. Our designer working on our floating bus stops in Silver Spring, which might be the only ones we have in place. I think there might be one or two in White Oak, but really we're looking at the Silver Spring ones primarily George on second and Wayne at Georgia is a floating bus stop that our designer's really been working on intensively. He's been heavily engaged in these issues. He's been refining our designs on the ground. It's changed quite a bit since it was first built a number of months ago. We anticipate that when we find a design that works, that will be our new standard, and we're hoping that that could even guide a national standard. We're somewhat on the leading edge of these issues here. We're working on getting it right. Can't say we're gonna, this is kind of our designer, Matt, who's been working on that one in Silver Spring. He's said it better than I'm probably going to say it, but we may not get it right the first try. We might not get it right the next try, but he's gonna keep trying, and eventually we're hoping to get closer and closer to something that really does work for everybody.
And I will mention that, we're not the first community to do floating bus stops. There's certain communities, especially out west, that have implemented many more. And so our folks at Andrew's organization, the DOT, are really in touch with them and working to make sure that all the lessons learned lead to facilities that really look at how you deal with all those issues. And certainly looking for providing cues for the blind and people with mobility impairments so that they can actually access these facilities is one thing, but also working on treatments in the bikeway so that bike riders know that they need to slow down or watch for crossers, they need to yield to the crossers, and maybe even creating some vertical deflection so that they have to change their travel behavior a little bit. But it is, as Andrew said, it is an evolving topic, and it we're going to keep working on it.
On page 80 shows a picture of that floating bus stop in Silver Spring that's on 2nd Ave. I say if you take a look at that picture, it may have already changed even more since we put that picture in there. It's a couple months old, I think, but it shows a lot of different features and how things have changed. It elevates bikes to slow them down. They have to veer in with a bicycle chicane to slow down and navigate that. We used the warning strips on the ground to help guide people through. There's a vertical flex post that helps guide when to cross. I think there's still room to improve that, but we're getting there.
Okay, another question. Is there going to be flexibility implementing improvements within an existing right-of-way while implementing features like separated bike lanes or like ped bike space, vehicle travel way, elevation differences, etc.?
Well, so I would say certainly the whole idea of the guideline is to provide flexibility in design, and that not every location is going to be exactly the same. So certainly we often take our cue from master plans, which we at the planning department we spent a lot of time putting together, and I think that we it then leads to DOT, and we work together to try to come up with solutions that we think really sort of fit the bill. We also have different, the physical terrain is different. Some streets have utility poles in just bad locations. and sometimes our projects can't move those utility poles overnight. So there's always going to be a slight wrinkle, and so that's why the guidelines provide sort of the flexibility to try to move things around depending on the priorities on that particular street.
Along those lines, Steve, how do the guidelines influence decisions on placement of utility poles and cabinets owned by other utilities such as Pepco and the telephone company, WSSC, all that stuff?
So these guidelines, they're for both new streets and for redesigning or improving existing streets. So with existing streets, there are a couple options. Is that one, when major improvements are done, we can have some slight modifications, but if we're talking about undergrounding, it's very expensive. But there are existing rules that are really documented in this guidelines for undergrounding in certain parts of the county and under certain conditions. And so that is pretty clearly spelled out about what can be done. On new streets, we would focus very hard on making sure that we're not putting major utility lines under the pedestrian clear zone or under a separated bike lane, for instance. I think one of the very frustrating thing for bikers is that the bike lane is often the pavement of last resort, and it's whenever there's construction, it's often closed, and delivery vehicles are often parked in it. And so, a lot of this guide is really trying to change that focus. So certainly in terms of utilities, if we do new streets, we want to make sure that we're putting utilities where they're going to impact all the users the least.
Great. It sounds like you've also answered the next question, which was talking about utility pole and cabinet placement that can end up anywhere. And in fact, there looks like there's a hydrant in the middle of the sidewalk on Ellsworth. So I think this is
actually, one thing I will mention, and it is in the guidelines, certainly in terms of intersections, is that even when not all facilities can be built with a particular project, we have to work awfully hard to visualize what we want in the future. And we need to make sure that we're not putting something in place that we're just going to have to tear up in 5 to 10 years. And so many times when we want to put bike lanes or even sidewalks, we find that signal controller cabinets are right in the way, or utility poles are right in the way, and there is usually adequate right-of-way where it could have been put someplace else. So we have to work a lot harder, I think, to dedicate that space, and that when major improvements are done to either our signal equipment or to utilities, that we say you have to move out of the way.
And I want to add, so these are guidelines. I can say we can technically exempt ourselves, but if we do, there better be a very good reason. Our vision is that there's nothing in those pedestrian clear zones. They should be clear. There shouldn't be poles, there shouldn't be hydrants. All that stuff should be in the street buffer, maybe the frontage zone, wherever, just not in the pedestrian clear zone. Anything in that clear zone is, I think everyone's right to call us out on it. It shouldn't be there. Obviously, there's existing a lot of problems to that effect. There's a lot of places that have hydrants in the middle of the sidewalk, poles sitting in the middle of the sidewalk. That's not good. It shouldn't be like that, and we're trying to change that.
Great. We are coming up. We're just past the last half-hour mark in this event. We said that we're going to stay on till 9 p.m. Is that right, Steve and Andrew?
Sure.
Okay.
I think as long as we have discussion topics, sure.
We'll keep going. All right. Well, with that in mind, if anybody is heading out, I did make an announcement in the Q&A of how you can submit your feedback. We have a survey that's available that you can provide some feedback with. You can also contact Steve directly, and his contact information is in that announcement. And then finally, if you want to provide testimony directly to the planning board chair on prior to the July 23rd meeting, you can submit your testimony to the email address provided. So just want to make sure everyone knows about that. We'll make that our last slide of the evening, but just want to make sure everyone has that available. And we've got another question here. Does the guide address requirements for maintaining pedestrian and bicycle circulation during adjoining redevelopment project construction rather than allowing huge detours, or, you know, will it do things like provide for covered sidewalks and bikeways when there's construction happening?
I think the answer to that is no, but I think that, you know, our guidelines inherently are focused on the fact that the priorities need to be much more balanced in how we design and improve our roadways. So it's not just for cars. And as I mentioned earlier, whenever there's construction, you know, the sidewalk gets closed or the bike lane gets taken over. We need to look much more carefully at how critical each of those facilities are and how we can work to provide them continuously. There was a bill that recently went through the council. I would say the number, but Andrew, you might want to chime in on this, which looked at this particular issue exactly.
Unfortunately, I don't know that bill detail myself, but other than I know it's generally trying to establish that there's a peds and bikes should have more priority in construction projects. I'm not familiar enough with the law and spelling out exactly how, when, but yes, at the guide, certainly we want to center pedestrians and bicycles much more. The guide, though, does not itself get into construction.
Somehow I think it's Bill 3318, but I could be wrong.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Something we haven't really touched on is where else we're seeing complete streets implemented. I know we're not the first. I would love to say that we were, but we're not. We are championing something that is proving to work in other places. Does anyone want to talk about where else complete streets is being implemented and our thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, it's actually, I would say from a city perspective, there are not many cities that haven't done complete streets. And actually, Montgomery County, we've done complete street type policies. I know in 2008 we did the context sensitive design guidance, and we also did sort of the transformation of our urban road code in 2014, where we implemented some complete street standards there. But this, you know, for us, this is a big upgrade. Within the DC area, certainly the District of Columbia, and it's too many to almost name, but Alexandria, Arlington, Prince George's County, Fairfax County, many different jurisdictions have complete street policies. They all vary somewhat. I think we feel like ours is extremely detailed, and I think the fact that it's tied in with our Vision Zero plan sort of makes it another thing. Another thing I want to mention is that, you know, complete streets, it's not just a U.S. thing or a Canada thing, U.S. and Canada thing, but a lot of the complete streets ideas came from Europe. There are many, they've been planning for multimodal networks much longer than we have. We focused pretty well on prioritizing cars. And so, you know, places like Denmark and the Netherlands have been providing tremendous bike facilities for years. And so we've, you know, the industry has stolen or borrowed from some of those countries. And you know, there is a complete streets coalition, nationwide, that does some really great advocacy on promoting complete streets within the United States and Canada. Should we go to another question?
Katie, you might be on mute.
Andrew, you totally get me. I was 100% on mute. I thought I was like, oh, I just perfectly phrased this question. No, I did not. Okay, so here's a question for you guys. Are any of the roads in the county being considered for road diets, or maybe even just piloting a road diet to see if it would work?
Well, what I'll say is road diets are actually an active strategy that the county one through master plans and DOT through just their maintenance and review of their facilities considers. We recently had a road diet proposed as part of the MARC Rail Communities Plan along Middlebrook Road in Germantown. And DOT is currently still studying that, but we feel very positively that at least some part of that road diet may be implemented in the next, 6 or 7 years, and that we look at these road diets not just from a hey, do we have excess capacity, but definitely from a safety perspective. The wider the road is, it's more difficult for pedestrians to cross the street, and so in areas where we can put in a road diet, hopefully slow traffic down, and provide facilities to help, to help pedestrians cross, and that will continue to do that. One, the planning department through the master planning process, and DOT through their typical road operations.
Yeah, we really do look to the master plans. I'd say it's probably the most important first step if people are interested in road diets out there. I think the master plans really help provide that direction. Of course, when it's in a master plan, can't say it'll be done tomorrow or even 5-10 years, but the master plan is saying it should be done at some point over the lifetime of a plan, and then maybe other conditions and steps that have to happen first before that can happen. But really, I think that's where it begins, and I think it's important.
Okay, we've got another question here, and I want to I hope I get this one right. So how do the guidelines address situations where the developer frontages are improved, but they didn't provide what they were supposed to, or adjacent properties have not dedicated their ground? So like, how do you get the right of way if it's not there? And how can we make better, more comfortable pedestrian and bicycle improvements when we've got all sorts of other competing issues like utility complications and other things in the roadway and the right of way?
So I think that's a much larger question. I know that our planning board chair had a concern in particular along state highways, where in some cases state would not agree with the planning board in the county that certain pedestrian improvements were needed because they would only span across a development project and they wouldn't continue. And I think we just need to continue to work to try to actively plan to complete these networks. But I think that this guideline by itself, it sets the vision for what we'd like to see. So at least, SHA will know this is what we intend along this particular type of road. But I think we're going to need to do more work to make sure we can get their concurrence to either accept those improvements or to then move forward with us to program improvements to complete the links.
I want to add to that. I'm kind of read the question a couple of different ways. I think it might also be asking if a developer comes in and he dedicates and is supposed to build out, let's say, 100 feet of right of way, but his neighbors on each side are 60 feet right of way. What do you do with that difference of 40 feet, or I guess really 20 feet on that side? How do you handle the transitions, or do they build, do they not build? If I'm reading that question right, I'd say like in those situations, our first starting place is we want them to build what makes sense to be built. We try some things can transition a little bit better, like sidewalks and bikeways might be easier to transition from. It's this far out in front of that property, but has to get closer in on the adjacent properties. Obviously, we don't want to make all these veering left and right generally, but you might be able to do this smaller transitions. But in some cases, it may not make sense to build that right away. So there are some ways they can basically do what's called fee in lieu. They may pay sort of an equivalent construction price for that work. It can go into, if there's a CIP to do that work, like Bethesda, we have a Bethesda Bikeways CIP. They might contribute toward that, and eventually we'll come through when we do have that right of way and build out that full facility.
Great, thanks. No, I think that was the right interpretation of that question. That makes a lot more sense.
But Steve is also a great answer. Thank you.
Hey, Andrew, since you're on deck, We haven't really spoken specifically about how this will affect travel to schools. How will this guide address school travel along many of these roads which don't have sidewalks or have traffic that's really fast where you absolutely need a sidewalk? Can you speak to more of that?
This guide doesn't really focus on schools specifically, but it does address many of the school-related issues nonetheless. As we've mentioned, this intends to slow speeds across the board. It also, each street type includes sidewalks, I think on both sides. That's certainly our vision that we're establishing here. Implementation, however, does still depend on funding. It still depends on community input. But there are some school-specific efforts, such as Safe Routes to School, that those will very much remain in effect. They may be a means of prioritizing or funding when these streets are brought up to these new standards or exceeding these standards. Obviously, we establish these target speeds. They can still go lower. We had that question way back early on. We're not going to try to increase speeds. That's not the intent here. If it's already low or lower, keep it that way. And similarly for schools, the Safe Routes to School might come through, decide 20 or 25 or whatever the speed limit, the target speed is for that street by the school. It could decide it still needs to be lower. It could still put up those flashers. It could put up school speed limits. That still remains in effect. This guide isn't getting into that detail, but it's still out there.
And I think it's important that this guideline will be used not just by could be used by folks working on safe roads to school, people working on just maintenance of existing residential neighborhoods. There are elements in the intersection chapter that talk about things like, curb extensions, which certainly along a road that provides a safe route to school to a school could be implemented during a major maintenance project. I will mention the neighborhood I live in was repaved last year, and there were major changes to the crosswalk markings. All the crosswalks that were painted are now the continental type, which is promoted in this plan. A significant improvement, and folks with kids were extremely happy because it basically sort of set a beeline right from the major roads towards the school, and provide I think a much needed comfort to parents that that when they get to these intersections, they will have a safer time crossing. Certainly needs to be followed up with as part of a safe routes to school plan with crossing guards and things of that nature. But I think this is a tool that can be used by other elements of DOT's agency.
I want to call out Wade Holland, added a bit more information about road diets. Wade Holland's in our county executive office. He's a Vision Zero coordinator. He's pointing out that SHA is in active construction of a road diet along Old Georgetown Road, close to NIH. And of course, we're working on the Middlebrook Road project near the high school up in Germantown.
And that's a great one because, that was such a terrible situation. But those terrible situations occur every day on some of our major roads in the county. And I would be much more encouraged if this same type of road diet was being considered on other roads that had events as tragic. So we need to continue to advocate for our citizens and certainly whether it's on our roads or state roads, that we're seriously looking at ways to make travel safer for pedestrians and bicycle users as well as cars.
Yes, I'm excited the state is doing what they're doing on Old Georgetown. I think that is huge. It's something I would not have guessed would come from the state. And I'm glad they're doing that. I think that design they're running forward with probably still needs more improvement, but it's just like I've been saying before, the door has been opened, and I'm glad to see that. And yeah, Steve nailed this. I think we need to see this more. I love everywhere, at least more.
All right, we got another question in. To what extent are different/safe levels of lighting specified for different types of streets, sidewalks, and bikeways, etc.?
I'm trying to find the section in the book right now that covers that, mostly because it's a subject I am not the most proficient in, but I know it does come up. It comes up a lot in the document. And I'm going to see if I can find something to point you more specifically toward. Oh, it might take me a little bit. I don't want to hang too much on that, but I know pages. Go ahead, guys.
I was going to say that's something that we can, if you provide your contact information, we can provide more information on that. Both both Andrew and I are civil engineers, but we focus more on road issues. But certainly, I would say from the pedestrian master plan, the importance of lighting to provide that level of comfort is critical. And there are just too many dark islands along our highways that we need to work very hard to fix.
Yes, yeah, sorry, I was trying to find a specific spot I could point you to, but I can speak a little broadly. Is the intent is we want road lighting and pedestrian lighting. Yeah, broadly, I think there's one of those tables that labels optional, recommended, required. I'm pretty sure it lists lighting as part of those rows. We are also working on redoing our lighting standards, but basically it's trying to address those dark spots. We don't want those. We want to try to have places lit. We want pedestrians to be visible, especially at intersections. So the broad answer is we want more lighting. The details of what kind of lighting, that's what I'm a little short on. I know we're working toward LED in general, but much more detail than that. Yeah, we'll have to get back to you if you provide your contact info.
All right. It looks like Andrew, maybe on page 59, section 4.10.
Oh, thank you very much.
No problem. We've got some great support on in the audience today. I think that may conclude it. We haven't had a lot of questions coming in at this point, and I know we want to get to our last slide where we plug all of our ways to participate. So, Steve and Andrew, is there anything else you want to close out with before you close out the presentation?
I would just say that, these have been great questions. And, there's a lot of information in this document. And, there are some things that are, there are many things in this document that aren't a change on what we do today. There are some things that are pretty dramatic. And there are some things that we're basically saying we're going to continue it. And a lot of detail needs to be worked out at the planning board level and eventually the council level. We definitely need your feedback on what you like, what you don't like, where are we not being bold enough, where are we missing the mark. As agencies, this document presents what we're willing jointly to put forward. And this public process will help hopefully push us in ways that we can't make that decision right now. Andrew?
I think feedback, big and small, is all good. I can't say that we'll be able to work everything into this draft, but I do think version 2 can fit in much more. I mentioned before my top need for version 2 is to focus on accessible parking spaces alongside curbside management. I think we're going to see more of that even before we have a version 2. We're going to see more of that just on its own effort. That feedback is fantastic, both guiding what we can do in this version and what will have to come up in the future.
So I guess I will, I'll just sort of read some of the elements of this last slide. Because this project is jointly hosted, we're jointly hosting the document, and we have slightly different formatted websites, but a lot of the same information is in both places. You can download the document. We also have a Survey Monkey that we've developed that will ask you some very specific questions, but also provide you some opportunity to go a little free form. But I think the real key here is that what really matters is what testimony is provided to the planning board. We're collecting the input that we receive. But I would say that the strongest input that you can provide, if you certainly feel strongly about it, is to write write written testimony, and depending on how our planning board hearings work, you may be even able to go online and speak. I haven't been, sort of post-COVID, I'm not quite up to date on how our public testimony procedures work, but I think that's a really critical point where we need to, we need to get as much input into that process so that by July 23rd, as many people can be heard on what they'd like to see changed in the plan.
And I was to add, whatever testimony reaches me, whether it's written, whether I hear it during the public hearing, to me, it's all the same. I value that written testimony as well. I know some can feel like it gets deprioritized, but behind the scenes at the staff level here, it's just as important. And if you're hesitant about speaking publicly or don't have the time or resources or whatever, just try to send something, email it in. That's very useful for us.
Yeah, and basically any feedback that we get from these meetings or other meetings, we end up sharing with certainly the chair, and I know certainly across agencies, as testimony is sent to to the council, they share it back with us as well. So we're I didn't want to discourage people from providing testimony. I'm just trying to note that the public hearing for the planning board is really the critical sort of deadline to get initial comments in.
And Steve, we just had one perfect question to close us out. They're asking if this meeting tonight is being recorded and where will it be available for people to watch if they want to watch it again, or if they want to share it with friends who are unable to make it tonight.
Okay, well, it is being recorded. And I don't know the answer to the second question. We'll have to talk with our IT folks to figure out how it can be provided.
Yeah, the intent certainly, if we can get it shared and accessible, we're going to do that on both websites. Both websites really have the same information. I'll admit, I think I like Steve's planning website better, but the same text, the same materials, the same documents and schedules.
Right, and at the beginning of this Q&A, if you scroll all the way to the top, there's an opportunity for you to officially sign in, which gives your name and your email address. We will let this entire group know when the recording is available and how to get to it, so that you can make sure you're aware and you can share it.
And sort of as a disclaimer, I will say that if you provide the sign up, unless you really don't want to, you're going to be added to an e-letter, and you will get updates on this project as it moves through to planning board and then on to council review. It would just be a periodic email. If you followed the bicycle master plan or the pedestrian master plan, you might be familiar with the e-letters. They show up periodically and just give you an update of here's where we are. And so if that's it, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and we hope to hear more comments from folks. And I think my outstanding comment is that if you have any questions, you can contact me or Andrew Bossy. And if you have an organization or people who are interested in hearing more about this plan, these guidelines, we'd be happy to do a mini presentation. Certainly anytime between now and July 23rd. And even if that can't be arranged, we could work something out through the summer and into the fall. So thank you everyone for showing up tonight.
Yes, thank you very much.